Okay, good afternoon. My name is Brandon, and I am a director with Conservatives for Tradition and an Integral Nation. Today, with me, I have one other director and a member. Who knows, one day he may become a director as well. I will let them introduce themselves, and then we will go on with the rest of the introduction for today's program.
I'm Siri Kalsa. I'm a director with the INI, and you've probably seen me before. Happy to be here.
I am Govind Vijay Kumar, and I'm a member. You always saw me in the last video. It's good to be here.
And for those of you who are unaware, we have already posted one roundtable. This will be roundtable number two. In the first roundtable, we sort of jumped in feet first, just talking about current events. Mr. Kalsa very graciously hosted that episode. I will be the host for this one. And I just want to take a sort of a step back. In the future, we'll be talking about current events and political events per the first episode. But today, just want to take a step back and sort of introduce the organization and sort of why we're even here and why listen to us, and talk a little bit about our philosophy. So, Siri, I kind of want to start with you. And the first question I want to pose to you guys is just tell us a little bit about the name of our organization, why it was chosen, and what does it mean to you. I'm going to attempt to be the best host possible for this episode, sort of stand back and let you guys just air it out.
Well, I think there was a lot of discussion put in the name, but Integral Nation, we kind of went back and forth with that. A big part of the discussion was can we use the word integral because it's associated with a certain Catholic political philosophy, but the idea generally was one nation or a unified nation. Not a decentralized nation or a divided nation. And as a group that values nationalism, obviously unity is very important to us. The second thing would be Conservatives for Tradition. And I think that everybody here who's involved with conservative politics generally at least pays lip service to the idea of traditional forms of organization, particularly the family, social organizations, and that was important to us because we feel that as our society gets more atomized, people are moving away from these structures that really anchor people and help to combat the kind of economic dislocation, mass media, constant mobility, and the other things that kind of break down our society and are causing people to kind of spin apart, get more divided, get weirder. And we see the results of that pretty much every day. And so reaching back to tradition, you have to anchor yourself in something. That doesn't mean we're trying to go back to the past. It just means that some of these basic questions we feel have been answered and that we can carry those forms into the future, whereas the prevailing philosophy now seems to be to break these forms down and hope for the best. And obviously, we didn't feel like that was a good idea.
And you really touched on something very good there. I think we need to talk about too. Um, you said that we're not looking to roll back the clock, and indeed we're not. We live in a new world, and however we feel like these ideas can be grafted onto the here and now. So I think it's important for our listeners to sort of get an understanding of if you could elaborate for our audience, where does this line of thinking originate from? Generally all great philosophies, it's not born out of thin air. It's usually a synthesis of previous philosophies, and it just sort of evolves. Can you speak to that for our audience a bit?
Well, I guess I would say modern right wing philosophy really started with the French Revolution and the reactions to it. And they went in all sorts of different directions. There were many different strands, some very disreputable and some very reputable. Modern American conservatism was a kind of Frankenstein monster that was assembled after the Second World War by a collection of special interests. And if you look at the various positions that were staked out, let's say in the 1960s by William F. Buckley and his organization, they really don't make any logical sense when put next to one another. It's clearly kind of just a pastiche, right? And so you were wondering where this came from. I think as the Enlightenment kind of reached its crescendo with the French Revolution, all sorts of things were under attack in that time frame and afterwards. Not just monarchies, but ideas like the family, or ideas like established religion in France. And all of that stuff seems a little bit quaint to us because most people back then were pretty agrarian and held to the standard social forms. But the seed was planted. And the reaction to that has taken many different forms. But the fundamental basis of it is that man is not really necessarily perfectible, and that the social forms that he thrives in best have by and large been established: fraternal organizations, families, religious organizations, things like this that people would lean on and use to anchor themselves have already been established. So the conservative part of it is that these forms are already there. Now, what they're going to be filled with, you're not putting old wine back into old bottles, but we believe that the basic ideas are still valid. And that if you break those bottles, we can see the liquid going everywhere. It's making a mess. And we can't continue to go in that direction because there's really no other alternative. We've seen in many societies what happens when things are just disrupted with no plan. We can name a bunch of different countries that have suffered catastrophic left-wing revolutions, and the results weren't pretty.
Well said. Guhan, turning to you, so Siri has sort of taken us back in the past and explained how we got here. I think our listeners would really benefit from possibly understanding why it is that this is relevant for America today. Why is it relevant to the here and now? Can you speak to that for us, please?
It's because for many Americans, when they think of conservative, they immediately assume that we are a religious a faction or a party, that we do stand for a traditional society. But reality is that the modern day Conservative Party, as pointed out by Siri, is sort of just a fusion of multiple different ideologies put together after World War II. In fact, the common ideology you've seen the term for is fusionism. It first appeared in the in the elections with LBJ by the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, who's arguably like our first and only libertarian candidate that had a chance to become president, because he tried to sort of fuse the conservative traditional philosophy with the sort of liberal economics, which we now know as free market capitalism. But that ticket failed, and so fusionism sort of returned under different brands, which succeeded under Reagan, hence the term Reaganism. But ultimately, there's where the flaws started to show. The liberal economic system of free markets seems to run contradictory to the social philosophy shown in traditionalism. This idea of a communal society where everyone works together for the benefit of all, that kind of clashes with the liberal economic system, which encouraged individualism and in turn more of a free for all, where everyone was out for themselves and fighting against each other. So trying to match these two opposing forces together proved to be very difficult. And it's then helped that at the end of the day, they were all practicing a form of liberalism, just not the French Revolution liberalism. It'd be accurate to say that the right wing liberalism is analogous to the American Revolution, the one that influenced our founding fathers, English liberalism, whereas the left represents the French form of liberalism. You even see it in the phrases, like in our Constitution, for example. Our First Amendment says freedom of religion. That sort of highlights what the English liberal character was. They were still religious to some extent. They simply wanted each person to decide their own fate. However, the French decided that they wanted to evict religious values entirely from society, hence their attacks on the Catholic Church. And it really was this French idea that eventually influenced liberalism in the US that led to our modern day system in the first place. If you were to trace the modern ideas of the left and their like atheistic and secular values and anti-tradition, you can trace it back to the 1960s with the rise of the hippie movement and free love movement, when they really declared war on tradition. Initially, this was opposed by both the Democrat and Republican parties, but at some point around like the 70s and 80s, but definitely in the 90s, when the Soviet Union fell, these progressive leftists made peace with the Democrat Party, and now they finally conjoined into this new liberal left platform that goes against traditional values such as the nuclear family and the sanctity of babies, as we see with the abortion movement, and that with the
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's also important to make the point that in these societies 200 years ago, they had markets, they had buying and selling. What we're not saying is that the market is incompatible with tradition, not at all. But when we say the kind of capitalist or free market ideology of post-war liberalism, it was an ideology of kind of regulatory capture, very large business, monopolistic practices, and kind of international finance, which distinguished it. Um, Nobody's saying just having a free market in, let's say, agricultural goods is going to undermine these traditional forms. That's really not what we were talking about. And I think American conservatism had grappled with that significantly better in the past, prior to the 1920s, especially during the post-Civil War.
Right, right. And Guhan, you brought up really an excellent point, and I want to touch on that for just a second. The point that I think that you brought up was essentially modern day Americans think of strictly left and right, and it's a very simple dichotomy. But we know that as we're moving along into the 21st century and as things have evolved, it's becoming more and more obvious that that's really not the case, that things are not that black and white. And so when we talk about conservative liberals and neoliberals and neocons and all of these labels, we tend to just put them in baskets of left and right, and that's it. And so when we say that this is all really a product of liberalism, it's very difficult, I think, for the average American voter to understand where we are coming from. And probably one of the best things that we found over the years to explain ourselves is just sort of take a step back and explain to the viewers why we're here. How did we reach the point where we're at now? Personally, what was our own personal journey and evolution that led us to this point? So I'll stick with you, Guhan. If you could speak to that for our audience, that could be helpful.
Yeah, I'll admit my politics journey did start when I was like in sixth grade. That was when our school had us do these current event assignments. You had to analyze news articles and give our opinion on them. And I was like, that's where our first dip into politics began. Naturally, I just went with whatever the news media was telling me because I think I was like 10 or 11 years old. I didn't really know any better. But as I got older, especially in the high schools, when I started getting more concrete opinions, at first you could say I was with the Republican Party. I supported George Bush and everything in the war. But then as I started to learn more about what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more importantly, seeing how incompetent he was being handled, I lost confidence in him and started to support more with Obama and the Democrats. Then fast forward to his second term, and I'm starting to notice he's also handling things pretty poorly. And not just with the war itself, but also with social issues, with economic problems. And didn't really know much about culture back then, so I can't speak for that. But I only see that both the Democrat and Republican Party had failed me. That when Trump was being elected, even then I didn't really have much confidence. It wasn't until literally 2017 I saw in a news article that the economy was finally recovering again that I take notice. So then I thought, no, finally, maybe you have a president who would get something done. And then he wasn't a complete disappointment, but he didn't change as much as I thought. He talked a big game, but eventually it turned out he just be just as lukewarm as previous presidents. I'd say he's like almost the modern day Ronald Reagan. So at that point, I became socially politically hopeless. I was trying to look through different parties, different ideologies, trying to figure out what was going on. I almost went to libertarianism at one point, but then I was sort of turned off by how irrational they were. Like the idea that they expected every human to be perfectly rational and always work for the best interest of all on their own. I thought that was a bit naive, to be honest. And that was when I started to look more into actually my own religion. I'm a Shaivite Hindu, and one of the things we are the center of our faith is this idea of the Varna system that every person in society had a certain role to fulfill, and that they must work together in order to survive. Kind of like how the human body has limbs. You have the head, the arms, the legs, and the feet. sure, some parts are more important than others, but no part is not important. And so that's essentially where I first got to the traditional systems. I thought, and maybe there's something in this traditional idea of society that could benefit us in modern times.
Right. Thank you for that, Guhan. And Siri, I know that you and I both are fairly well read on our proto and or founding philosophers, if you will. Can you explain for our viewers a little bit about what initially led you down the road to read those authors and philosophers? What led you to the point that you're at now?
Well, it's a good question. And I do just want to quickly comment on something Guhan said, because the analogy of the different organs of the body reappears over and over in nationalist writing in the 19th century. That this one is the spleen, this group, the manufacturers do this, the miners do this, the farmers do this. All of that has to work in tandem to make the nation work. And if one organ is sick, the whole body is sick. And it's a great analogy. But what caused me to start reading the founding authors? So I was kind of a young Republican during the Iraq War era with the kind of opinions that you would expect one to have. And I think after the first Obama election, things were kind of going along. And I think around 2012, I started noticing maybe it was just the rise of social media, maybe it was something else, but the tone in media coverage was starting to get very weird, right? And where it had been subtly biased before, it was getting really biased. And at a certain point after that, I just noticed that arguments stopped working on people with different opinions. Perhaps you've noticed this, that people just at some point in the 2010s became immune um, to evidence and argumentation. And that hadn't been my experience 10 years before that. I remember, kind of college rap sessions where you could convince people of a position or they could convince you of a position. And it just wasn't the case anymore. It was like this kind of strange posturing instead of dialogue that had taken over. I thought it was very creepy. And then as the social change really started picking up, um, in my opinion, very organically. I remember it because, I wasn't a kid. I was a married man with kids, and I noticed the media just flip right on the gay marriage thing is just one of the many issues, but it just went like this. And it became a moral posturing thing, and it was just broadcast. And so I started to think, how did this come about? Like, how is the logic of our system leading to this? Because I could see that what they were saying was philosophically based and kind of the same stuff I took for granted. And so I started kind of cracking open some books, and I realized that liberalism essentially was the seed that this was all growing out of. They weren't wrong about this. This kind of was the logical progression of those ideas carried into different domains. And previous generations had just made increasingly unprincipled exceptions in this or that part of society. And so that's what really spurred it. And once you kind of leave the farm there, you can't go back. That's what I've always told people. And nobody I've known who's departed from that path has ever wanted to go back, unless it's just pure cowardice or they're scared to lose their job or something like that. But if you talk to them in private, they'll know it's bogus. Because once you can see the flaws in the argument, it just doesn't work on you anymore. Their foundational ideas are false. And if they were false, I knew that that had to be the source of why this was going awry, because the truth wouldn't do this. And as our societies continue to get crazier, I think my pessimism has been borne out. And at that point, I knew like that there had to be a better way. And the better way, I think, largely is found in some of these social institutions of the past, adapted to our future needs and future technology.
Okay, we'll have to cut that part.
That's okay.
Had a phone call come in. Okay, so Siri, it's just pretty interesting. That was a great answer, by the way. But you did bring up an interesting point that I just wanted to sort of double down on. You're a few years older than myself. However, I'm not too young to remember when the news was the news, and it basically covered the topics of the day, mostly in an unbiased way.
Yeah.
I think you and I both started noticing that one way shift. It
It was
almost got
after
to the right.
2012. Yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely was. Yeah.
Yep. And we could probably do an episode on that all for its own, because I think we know why that happened.
Yeah.
So the next question I want to pose to you guys, what is it about this brand of conservatism that sets it apart from your typical Western variety of liberal conservative? We've touched on this a bit, but I really want to nail this down some more. What is it specifically, in your own opinions, that makes this brand of conservatism separate than liberal conservatism of the Western world?
I'd
If
say
you could take it first, that's great.
I say the biggest difference is that we're not limited by what our idea is left wing or right wing, as we brought up before. We're willing to consider any kind of solution, regardless of what ideology it's attached to, provide as long as that's logical and has shown working results, or at least in theory it can work. The biggest example would be our position on trade unions, or just the idea of labor representation in general. That's traditionally seen as a left wing idea when associated either with the left wing, like socialist or even communist groups. But we believe that trade unions and as any kind of labor representation is an integral part of the economy and just society in general. I think my personal favorite example would be the sort of neo-corporatism that they practice in the Germanic countries, where essentially co-determination, where on certain companies, their board of directors has representatives of both the employees and the shareholders. So that way the workers have representation within the company itself. And that's something you won't really see American companies generally endorsing. If anyone in America does it, it's usually someone who claims to be from the far left. But we believe that such a system could actually is not only not opposed to traditional values, but could actually be used to reinforce them in the society.
Siri, would you like to comment?
Well, I mean, I think the results have spoken for themselves. If you look at the Tory party in the United Kingdom, our own Republican Party, conservatives in Canada, they failed to conserve anything that they set out to conserve. Traditional gender roles gone, marriage destroyed, right? What have they conserved except the power of capital to capture regulations, right? They haven't preserved the middle class. They haven't preserved people's purchasing power where it matters in housing and healthcare. Prosperity is increasingly going to the owners of large amounts of capital because they already have a captive position basically on the economy. All the quantitative easing, as per the Cotillon effect, flows up first. And that's kind of an indictment of their entire strategy. So, what makes us different? Yes, we don't have those same sacred cows. Of course, there's things we're not willing to compromise on. But the reason this is different and it can work is because it's structural and it's radical without being violent, right? It's radical without being destructive. It's conservative in the best sense, which is that we want to build things up. We don't want to tear them down, but they need to be built back up again. It's reconstruction, right? It's not revolution. What have they conserved? If you could look at the party platform of any of these conservative parties from the 1950s, 60s, probably even 1970s, you'll find that every one of their initiatives, except perhaps lowering taxes, has been an absolute failure. What has it done? Ronald Reagan promised to get rid of the Department of Education. Does anybody remember this? No. There's all sorts of things. And now test scores have been slipping for 30 years, and we still have the Department of Education. So, here we are. So I think their own blind spots, their need basically to constantly go back to the sources of capital and make sure that they're their highest priority, no matter what, no matter the effect on the nation, right? It's completely blown out the other sides of their platform. That's proved to be their sacred cow. Everything else they'll compromise on, right? But what will they go to the wall on? That one issue.
Yeah.
We saw this. We saw this during the Obama era. Remember, what did they shut down about? It was taxes. That's what they shut down the government for. And so there's only so much disillusionment I think one person can take before they start to look for alternatives. I think a lot of people are getting
Right. And your average conservative, they always claimed that they wanted to conserve traditional institutions like the church, and yet on the other hand, they turned around and attacked arguably the most important institution, which is the state,
there.
thereby
Yeah, this is a great
undermining
example.
all of their efforts.
It's a great example. America was, no offense to Roman Catholics, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, anybody like that, but this country was founded by basically the mainline Protestant branches. And what has happened to those churches since they've adopted basically liberal priors? They've completely emptied out, right? They're basically just NGOs at this point, doing a little bit of charity here, resettling refugees there. But they're closing
Counseling.
churches, they're selling property,
Yeah.
they're in a death spiral, right? So, how has conservatism benefited the Methodists and, the PCUSA and all these other churches? I don't think it has.
There's thousands of them.
Yeah.
So actually, this is a fantastic segue into the next question, which is, and we'll start with you, Guhan, just to keep things, on the back and forth. But in your mind, what are some key issues? Try not to cover the whole spectrum. We'll leave some for Siri. But what are some key issues in your mind that we are facing as a country, and how does traditionalism address them?
I'd say a big issue would definitely be the culture. As the more accurate to say, there's not a culture problem, or that the culture itself is disappearing. You ask the average American today that what does it mean to be an American? What's like the American identity? They honestly can't give you an answer because like there is no meaning anymore in life. To them, the U.S. has become just like a place that they live in with a name attached. And unfortunately, it's not even it's done by accident. It's basically being promoted by a lot of our own public officials. Hence why it's talk of open borders, unlimited immigration, and to not define yourself as patriotic unless you be offensive to some group. So that's honestly where traditionalism, we have to rediscover what it means to be Americans. Unfortunately, that's something that our so-called defenders, the Republican Party, has ultimately failed at. So,
Siri, do you care to comment on how traditionalism addresses some key issues facing America?
Well, yes, there are a lot of thoughts, but I did want to segue off the identity thing because I think it's a little darker. It's true that they can't really name anything that would make you an American. There's no particular category that they would say is determinative, right? Somebody could get off the boat and speaking a completely different language, different religion, not from here, ethnically different, all that kind of stuff. And there's really no basis that they can say you are or aren't. But I think it's darker because I think what they're coming to is that, well, it's a set of propositions, it's ideas, right? And so the flip side, the negative, right, the logically necessary position from that is that if you don't hold those ideas in your head, you aren't one of us, meaning you, me, everybody in this Zoom room. If you don't hold liberal ideas in your head, you're not a real American. And that's kind of why you're seeing, I think, the increasingly violent rhetoric coming from certain sides because they need that friend enemy distinction, like Carl Schmitt talked about, right? The basis of politics is us and them. And without that, it's going to swim around till it finds it. And the only acceptable place is ideas, which is scary because it takes quite a lot of state power to figure out what your ideas are. How can conservatism, how can traditionalism benefit this country? Was that the question?
Yeah, what are some key issues in your mind that faces the country, and how does our brand of conservatism address them?
Well, Guhan covered the culture, and that's a huge one. Trade, obviously, is another huge one. The traditional economic policy in this country is one of tariffs and internal development. We got away from that after World War II. And we could get away with it for a decade or two because the rest of the nation, the rest of the entire globe was, bombed out ruins, right? So we were the manufacturing power, period. But as the rest of the world recovered, the consequences of us getting rid of that became apparent, and we're just feeling it today. Going back to our traditional policy, which is continental development, we have an entire continent's worth of resources that once we wired them up in the 1890s, turned this country into a superpower. If we could go back to that, you would see industrial development in America again. A second thing is military. We found ourselves in the position of the British Empire where we're stretched all over the globe, way too thin, spending way too much money, fighting stupid wars that don't really matter to us because we've assumed this position of global guarantor of trade. And that also makes us deindustrialized because we have to run deficits and sell bonds, right? And maintain this trade balance around the globe, which means we can't put tariffs on because we're the global bank. And so going back to what we used to do, which is that we had relatively high tariffs and a solid currency, I think would fix a lot of those problems. We don't need to spend so much on the military. We have a fortress here. We do. And that's just a couple of the issues.
Fortress America. And just to touch on something that you said, you can come here from, you can have different religion. There's really no identifier to what is an American. And you put it in terms of dark and light. And to me, the really dark thing about it is you can actually come to this country with a completely different culture, as long as ultimately, once you're here, that culture conforms with corporate culture. And that's the same thing as PC culture, really.
Yeah.
So another really great segue, actually. One issue we are absolutely adamant about addressing is the economic sphere. We hold to a very different view about our industrial, financial, and otherwise economic institutions and how they should interact with the state. Here, too, we hold to a more traditionalist, pre-modernity, anti-liberal economic sort of a model. Now, here, our detractors could be forgiven, for charging us with we're just trying to be traditionalists for the sake of being traditionalists. After all, didn't capitalism make us the most wealthy country in the world? Why would we want to deviate from that and choose a different path? But I can promise our viewers that we are not traditionalists in every category, just for the sake of being to say that we're different or to differentiate ourselves. There's a reason for that. And Siri, could you talk a little bit about the practicality behind that economic model and that the economic philosophy that we propose?
Well, I would say that corporatist economics is premised on a couple of different points. The first is that industries can broadly be cooperative and that it's not a zero-sum game necessarily. There can be competition within the field, but monopoly is basically to be avoided. And it's important to keep that competition bounded, meaning to avoid regulatory capture, to avoid international competition that's based on some sort of unfair advantage, like very cheap labor, no environmental laws, no labor laws, things like that. And so with the state encouraging industry and encouraging cooperation in the industry, I think we can really regain a lot of economic strength. A lot of our so-called economic prosperity since the 1970s has basically just been strip mining a lot of the assets that were built up over the preceding century or two. So I'm thinking particularly about machining. Before World War II, there were 30,000 independent tool and die shops in this country that could rapidly retool to make absolutely everything that was needed to wage a total war. Now, I believe we have one, which is in Orange County, California, and it's a large factory, but we simply can't do it anymore. We don't have the shipyards. We don't have anything that we used to have to do it. And back then, the cooperation took place on an informal basis. There would be guys with a high school education or less that would come up with a new process and go start their own shop, share their advance with other people. And it just percolated throughout the industry because that's kind of what the culture promoted. But we need something more formal to change our current system, because the way it's done now, um, basically the state's looking to ambush you with regulations, or offshore where they can find cheaper labor, or an input that they can get cheaper because it's there or something like that, because there's no tariffs and shipping's become cheap thanks to us subsidizing it. The whole system is just kind of rigged to make everything flow out of this country because we're a high wage nation now.
And I think it's a common misconception in liberal economics that economics is simply about money. And maybe that is true in our current system, but we fanatically feel, I hesitate to use that word because it can be misconstrued, but we very strongly feel that it's also philosophical, because the two things that we face is fluidity and identity. So with the current economic system, we think of fluidity. When we think of fluidity in our current political discourse, our minds go to transgenderism and gender fluidity. But on the opposite side of the aisle, all of this time, and for even longer, they've been talking about professional fluidity, where there is really no job security. That's where you get the term the precariat. We're so precarious in our vocations in life, and they want you to be able to just pick up and move, and change jobs, and the employer can get rid of you just like that. Well, how is that pro-family? The other thing is identity. As human beings, psychologically, we tend to identify. We're the apex social being. So we identify with what we do. As a matter of fact, the technical definition for consumerism is you identify yourself with a brand. So with the economic scheme that we propose, it restores your identity and hopefully self-worth and pride, because now as a human being, you can identify with your profession. You can identify with your trade. So philosophically and psychologically, I think that's part of it too. And all of this goes way back into history. It goes back to medieval Europe, the guilds of medieval Europe. It goes back to the corporations in the Roman Empire. So, do you have any thoughts about the economic sphere and why it is we propose that we do?
I'd say like our biggest flaw in our current system is how much the middle class has been destroyed.
Good
Like I
point.
see like you see basically that there's only two kinds of worker going on. You either have like the very poor people who are just either employees or wage earners, and then on the other side you have the conglomerates, basically these massive corporations. And I would hesitate to even refer to them as businessmen, because that would imply that their current fortune and business is entirely self-made based on their own merits. It's not. Most, if not all, these big companies are basically heavily allied with the central government. They take subsidies and tax breaks from them, and I use tax breaks. They're not for the average person. It's only for these big corporations. And in turn, the companies selectively regulate and sue people who oppose these companies. Eventually, the government has turned to their own personal hitman. There's no genuine competition anymore. And through this, they basically hijacked and taken control of the entire economy. And they continue to dupe the people into thinking they're legitimate businessmen. That if like a person just works hard enough, they can become their own self-made businessman and millionaire. But that's all really a lie right now. If you try to do that, you would, in best case scenario, simply get bought out by the big company. Worst case scenario, the government will come after you and tear your business out, and then force you to sell it to the company anyway. So I think, and that's really against what traditional economics used to be like. In traditional society, it's the small business, small or medium-sized company, or as we know as the family-owned company, that was the center to economic life. That usually was like small mom and pop shops, self-employed people, small farms and landowners. These were the people who were the backbone of the economy. And even in the U.S., that's who was the backbone of our whole industry. Even as industrialization was going on at its height, you still had these small businessmen who were running things. It was only when the big business, or the trust as they used to be known, took over, did the economy really start to go downhill. Now, Theodore Roosevelt did try to fight them, but really he was more of a trust regulator than a trust breaker. The conglomerates still held major influence, and as the 1800s and later 1900s went on, their influence only grew stronger and stronger with our economy, and now it's reached a breaking point for us. So for we would so for after us, we restructure both our regulation system and economic laws to favor the small and medium sized companies that and ensure that they are the new backbone of the U.S. instead of these massive conglomerates.
And Guhan, you're once again you're doing this program a great service, because that's a perfect segue. It just so happens to the next question that I wanted to bring up for discussion. You did touch on the American middle class, and people who know me know that I come from a different background than most. In Conservatives for Tradition and an Integral Nation, I come from the Democratic Party. I come from a Southern Democratic sort of a background. And one thing that was talked about when I was first getting into politics, sometime around 2001, 2, 3, I was really getting into politics. The Democratic Party talked on the campaign trail, at least, almost incessantly about growing the middle class. And when people voted for their wallets, they voted economics, and the Democrats won. Conspicuously in today's political discourse, it doesn't matter what side you're on, whether you're in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's rare that you actually hear anybody seriously put forth a platform or plan to grow the middle class. You just don't hear it. So the question that I want to ask, and this has really happened over roughly, I would say, the past 15 years. Probably the past 15 years, the conversation surrounding the middle class has fallen off the map completely. So, obviously we find this abhorrent and unacceptable. We'll start with you, Siri. How do you envision our ideas addressing this travesty?
Well, I think if you're going to increase the amount of industry and all the types of supporting companies that go along with that in this country, you will build it back up, because it's not the type of labor that you can just use hourly, transient, kind of fluid labor, right? Going back to this idea of fluidity, the way our current system wants labor to be, they want it to be just as fluid as capital, right? You can send $1 billion to the other side of the world with the press of a button instantly. And they want labor to be like that, because then it can just be shifted around at maximum speed, right? With maximum viscosity, right? So that it doesn't heat up the engine too much, and it can just be put wherever they need it. But if you have serious industry, extractive industries, and secondary industries on that, that's not labor that's fluid, that's skilled labor. And increasing the supply of skilled labor is going to make middle class jobs, because you frankly just can't hire and retain people to do that kind of work for anything less than a real salary. And that's what you had in this country during the period of our industrial strength from about the 1930s through the 1970s. Were things perfect then? No, they weren't. But you could get those jobs easily, and you could buy a house, and you could make the kind of significant life purchases. You could pay for tuition, you could pay for medical care. All of that stuff was achievable, home ownership, with that kind of work, because you can't just plug a warm body in to do that stuff. You need actual skilled operators.
And I think that you answered that quite well. So, Guhan, forgive me. I'm going to throw you a bit of a wild card. Since he answered that aspect of the question so thoroughly, I want to ask you, why is it, do you think, that we have completely abandoned the middle class in this country?
I have to say, and it's going to be sound like a very cliche answer these days, the lobbying system. Now, at this point, every American at some point just realize that the lobbying system is affecting us in some way. But many don't realize like why it came out in the first place. Like congressmen wake up one day and decide that the richest people should just decide everything. Initially, when our founding fathers made lobbying, it was with the idea that Congress would get expertise advice as certain political subjects. Because like when it comes to the economy, most congressmen were educated in law professions. They didn't really know much about how business were run, let alone the exact mechanics going into certain industries like engineering or chemistry. So it was believed that by having industries come in and offer advice, they could help steer policy in the right direction. And they do. The problem is these companies are always giving a very biased advice, so that they ensure that the policy steer towards their specific company or sort of group of companies rather than the industry as a whole. You can tell that a lot of these lobbyist groups are specifically paid for by certain big companies. They don't really represent these smaller corporations within their industry. A good example would be the agriculture sector, where all of the major farms are represented by this the name eludes me, but there's one single agricultural lobbying firm that lobbies on their behalf and usually advocates for increasing the regulations on the manufacture of certain agricultural products to ensure that smaller companies are priced out of it. And unfortunately, the smaller companies, due to their small size, they don't have the financial weight to counter this sort of legal action. And so are first to let essentially get rolled over and to now apply this to every single sector of the economy and combine this with a deindustrialization that has occurred, depriving many of the old industries or strengthened the political discourse. And so now our entire government is sort of being controlled by the few major corporations in a few select sectors. And they have now decided what policy gets put forward, but not only that, who even gets elected. After all, campaigns are run on donations, and and politicians who give policies beneficial to these large donors will get elected. And so now they basically become the power brokers in our system. And if they're the ones with the power, they'll decide what laws are made. And why wouldn't they make laws that benefit them alone and no one else?
Well said.
I'm reminded of a magazine article I read a year or two ago about the Rolodex test. Do you remember this? Maybe it was 22, maybe it was 2018, where these new Democratic candidates that were running in a primary had to show their essentially digital Rolodex of their donors, you know, to see who the party wanted to favor, to see if they were serious, right? How much money can you raise, with 10 phone calls or 50 phone calls or whatever? Pretty crazy.
And then you have the donors as well, the lobbyists who fuel the military industrial complex, and they have an interest in keeping these foreign wars going so that they can enrich themselves. And ultimately, what does it do but hollow out the middle class?
It even has hollowed out our military industry, ironically. If you looked at the numbers of how many missiles we can make, it's pretty disheartening. It's become a boutique industry because they've decided to tack on all the bells and whistles and charge top price. We can't produce things like we did, let's say, in the Vietnam era. It's just not possible. The factories aren't there. The mines aren't there. The people to manufacture all the little parts aren't there, or those shops are in China. So, it's a self-defeating proposition, and the idea is to stop it and rebuild it before it defeats itself.
Absolutely. Our manufacturing base is long gone.
Yeah,
And
I like to
along
touch on
with
something on
paying
that.
wages.
Yep.
Guhan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to bring up a rather interesting point that our lack of manufacturing has itself affected our war fighting. People don't realize that the idea of a defense industry is a very recent idea. That usually it was regular civilian manufacturers who made all of our equipment. Like World War II, most of our weapons and machines were being made by the auto manufacturers in Detroit. So the same company that made your home car is now the one also making the tanks and the fighter airplanes. So ironically, by making a dedicated industry, the industry is you basically have cut off the manufacturing sector from one of their biggest markets. And so, ironically, in an effort to better prepare America's defenses, you've ironically crippled our own logistics in doing so.
Well, I was reading just earlier, uh, you look at the Russo-Ukrainian war. Russia is having no issues whatsoever supplying their troops. They've had some issues getting the equipment to them, but producing the equipment, they don't have an issue. On the Kupiansk front, they've produced brand new artillery systems by almost the hundreds, and they're about to ship them straight to the front. They
See,
have
people
huge
people used to people used to make fun of the paranoid tank and missile factories beyond the Ural Mountains when I was a kid, right?
they have a huge base of natural resources, and they can make it right there in country. Some of the drones they have to get from abroad, but other than that, they can pretty much source it and manufacture it themselves. But
Well,
w-
yeah, we
with
just
that,
decided to get rid of that.
yeah. Well, with that, we are at time. So I very much appreciate you gentlemen joining us and having this discussion. I think it was excellent. For our viewers, if you liked it, we're going to be coming out with many, many more of these, and hopefully much more often and regularly. We may do one this coming week, not this coming weekend, next weekend.
Yes.
Um,
Look for our news roundup.
look for our news roundup. Check us out on our website, which is www.integralnation.us, not .com. If you like it, like and subscribe, of course. That's going to help us out tremendously. We're really just getting off the ground. So any support that you can lend us is absolutely indispensable at this point in time. But thank you for checking in with us, and look for our new roundtable next week. Have a great day.